Hey everyone, so in this video we want to get an overview of the most important RBD constraints out there. There are actually more than those, but they are not used anymore or they're very old and all that kind of stuff. So we only look at the ones that are actually used in production to my knowledge. Keep in mind though, during the first part of the course, the main part, we only talk about the first constraint, the glue constraint that we already looked at. That's because it's the easiest to use and it's enough to explain all the core concepts of RBD. So while every single piece of RBD is not very complicated, it later on can become quite complex. So for example, if you have different materials like wood and concrete and glass, and you have to kind of keep track of the connections between all those, it becomes very complex. And this is why I want to concentrate on the glue constraint during the main part of the course. But later on in the bonus lessons, we will also look at the more complex constraints that we at least get an overview in this video over. So let's say you don't have any constraint, then of course it looks like this. And this is the example we will be using in this video, and excuse the simplicity of it, but basically it's the best way to show how these constraints work. So without any constraint, the pieces are pre-fractured and they fall down and they're actually already broken. It's just that when any impact is coming, they're just fall apart completely. And you can see that actually here that there is just a Voronoi and there's no connection coming from the constraints to our solver. Now the next one we already looked at is the glue constraint, and here you have actually a connection between the pieces, so they stay together unless they get an impact and then they can break. And what you can see here is that the glue constraint is a rigid connection. So it's either together or it's broken. There is no, anything in between. And this is where the next couple of constraints come in, the hard and soft constraint. The hard and the soft constraint are basically the same. And this sounds a bit weird because obviously the name is the complete opposite. But you have to understand that the hard constraint existed first and only then came the soft constraint. Actually, the soft constraint is pretty new. I think it came in with Houdini 17.5 or something. So it's not very old. And it basically does the same. So first of all, where did the name of the hard constraint come from? Actually, unlike you would imagine, the connection that it creates is actually not hard, it's soft, and it looks like this. And what you see here is actually, that it's a soft connection, you could call it. It's not rigid, but the reason it's called hard is that it can actually not break. So no matter how much impact we put onto this thing, it will never break. And this is where the name comes from. Now, why is that interesting? Why is that important? Well, because, for example, metal can be simulated that way. And we will talk about this in a video in the bonus lesson. But also you can simulate stuff like concrete that is filled with metal bars. And this is actually something that happens in reality. Real buildings in reality are not actually made of concrete alone. They are built in a combination with metal bars to keep a certain bendability, let's call it, so that the building actually becomes more stable that way. So you can simulate stuff like that. And what we'll see later is you can even actually force the system to break, while the hard constraint, again, by itself cannot break. It's not built into the system. Of course, you can always go in and manually do whatever you want in Houdini. And there's actually a technique that allows you to just delete the constraints, which are just, primitives, curves that you can remove under certain conditions. And this is something we will look at later. But by itself, keep in mind, a hard constraint cannot be broken. And this is where the name comes from, unlike the glue constraint that has kind of breakability built in. Now, again, the soft constraint is nothing else than the newer version of the hard constraint that came from side effects. And the main advantage to the hard constraint, and let me quickly show you how a simulation of a soft constraint looks like. And as you can see, it's basically the same. It's a bit less stiff, but this is something we can actually adjust in the constraint, and this is where the big advantage lies. So the soft constraint, when you look here, it allows you actually to control the stiffness. This is something the hard constraint doesn't have, and this is something that FXCD struggled with many years, that they couldn't directly influence the stiffness. Of course, there were techniques like higher subframes and so on to make it harder, but it was not directly built into the constraint. And this is better with a soft constraint, which is why a lot of this stuff we'll look at in the bonus lesson we will do with a newer soft constraint. But both of them, again, are basically the same in that they allow to constrained pieces in a way that is soft, actually. So the objects do move against each other. There is a room of movement, but they never break. And this is, again, where the original name came from. Now, let me quickly show you why this is important. Again, like I said, it's important for metal, but it's also important if you want to have a more advanced destruction simulation of, you know, how buildings, for example, are actually made, which is that they first bend before they break. They don't instantly break. And I have a comparison here so that I can show you what the advantage is of a hard or a soft constraint. This is a glue constraint, and again, it just breaks instantly, and there's no, you know, in between. And then there is this roughly the same, but with a soft constraint where it first bends a little bit and then breaks. So when you look at it, it feels a bit more complex because it feels like it needs a certain amount of force before it actually breaks. It doesn't instantly break. And that makes destruction simulations usually feel much more realistic with a soft or hard constraint. But again, we will not look at this in the main part of the videos because it would just overcomplicate the setups. That said, now that we've seen the glue constraint and the hard and the soft constraint, and you can tell that those three constraints are the most important ones when you look into the RBD constraint properties node, which is one of the many nodes you can use to define the constraints in your simulation. And this is a relatively new node that comes from side effects only since the last few versions. And it kind of shows you how important those three are, because those three are the only ones you can choose here in the newer RBD setups. And this is why I will concentrate on them during the course. Now, besides fracturing stuff, you can also use the hard constraint to simply attach things to something. So what we will look at is an example where we just create some kind of pendulum object, a wrecking ball. And as you can see here, the constraint is used to attach a ball to, you know, some point in space in our case, so it can swing around it freely, basically. So this is another use for a hard constraint, a very common one. It needs a bit more work because you have to create it manually, which we will look into. And then at the very end, we will also look at something that the three that we now talked about, the glue constraint, hard constraint, and soft constraint, cannot cover, and that is angular movement or rotations. So if you have something like a wheel or maybe a hinge of a door, for example, then what you need is a cone twist constraint. Again, a bit more complicated to set up. This is why we put it at the end, and you don't need it that often. But I just wanted to mention that because sometimes you need that kind of constraint as well. So for now, I hope this is helpful as a rough overview. We will look into all of these constraints in more detail in the next videos. So thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.